Hey folks, T's Daily, I'm back with you again. Thanks for tuning in. This is the next video taking a look at Tranzistow. In this case I want to take a look at just the general signal flow that you'll find and encounter with Tranzistow and the modules that you'll be dealing with in regards to that kind of aspect. So that'll entail having a look at the mixer, the balancer, the vector, and the amplifiers, which you'll find on the filter amp tab. So I guess we'll just get straight into it. It shouldn't be as long-winded as the last video, but I'll try and keep this, I'll try and make this as comprehensive as I can, and if I omit certain parameters or aspects, it's probably because I may be unsure of exactly how it functions in Tranzistow. There's a few parameters I'm still not 100% sure on what their functionality is actually doing. But I'll try and, keep this as informative as I can, helpful as I possibly can. So just let's get into it. So I've got a initial preset loaded up here, which is just your basic straight up sawtooth you get. And that's by default, that's coming from the auxiliary oscillator. You can see down here, the modules showing we have saw wave coming from auxiliary oscillators. The main oscillators are off. And the only other module that's engaged at this point is filter B. So what we've got is auxiliary oscillator 1, the sawtooth coming out from that, feeding into filter B, number 1, and then that feeds out from filter B1 into amplifier 1, and then that comes to the output that we're hearing. So with Tranzistow, the general idea is that we have 4 separate and independent signal lanes, like sort of chains of like modules, so to speak. You have 1, 2, 3, and 4. As you can see, like you have groups of 4 of each module, and it basically by default it correlates to each of these 4 lanes of signal flow. So oscillator 1 feeds into filter 1, oscillator 2 will feed into filter 2, 3 feeds into 3, and 4 into 4, and so on. Okay, so it's the same with the filters coming into the amplifiers. So you basically, the oscillator is going to be the start of the signal chain that generate the sound, the tones. The filters will come in after the oscillators, and then if you engage the mixer or the other kinds of mixing modules like the balancer and the vectors and that, they follow the filters, and then the amplifiers come following the mixers, and that's kind of the final stage before the signal hits the effects section, which is the last stage before the main output. So yeah, basically by default we have the 4 lanes where each number correlates to its own sort of signal path. Now by default you can't route, say, oscillator 1 into filter 2 and then route that into amplifier 3, for instance. They're all kind of fixed. So oscillator 1 goes to filter 1, which goes to amplifier 1. Now there are provisions that allow us to take the signal flow a little bit further than that, and you get a little more flexibility. But to do that, we're going to need to engage several modules, probably the balancer or the mixer. You'll find on the mixer tab the balancer parameters on each mixer. So you see you have balance 1 and 2, which they reside on mixer 1 and 2. And then we have balancer 3 and 4, which reside on mixers 3 and 4. So the balancers allow us to cross the paths of 1 and 2 as a pair, and 3 and 4 as a pair. Okay, so that allows us to route, say for instance, the signal coming out of oscillator 1 or mixer 1 through to filter 2 and vice versa. But it doesn't, the balancers don't allow us to route 1 and 2 across to 3 or 4, or to come from 3 or 4 back over to 1 and 2. They're sort of tied to the pairs. So you can see balancer 1 and 2, which basically works between the first and second lane of signal flow, and 3 and 4 pertains to 3 and 4. Okay, so if you want to go further than that, you can actually route signals across into, you know, any kind of arbitrary lane, but to do that you will need to engage the mixer module. So we'll turn these on. I'll turn the vector on as well, because these are the ones we're mainly going to be looking at. Now, if we wanted to set this up properly, so we're going to turn the auxiliary oscillators off and turn on the main oscillators. So now we can hear what's happening, and that's because the mixer by default is receiving the signals from the main oscillators. So I'll turn those up. So I'm now bringing in the main oscillators into mixer 1. So oscillator 1, 2, 3 and 4, because each mixer has 4 independent signal inputs, and these can be taken from anywhere throughout the synthesis engine of Tranzistow. So any module that has an output, you can tap from here, from the mixer inputs, and that's pretty flexible. Like you can go, it's basically, you know, you've a lot of options. You've got a lot of points where you can tap the signal from, whether it's oscillators or envelopes or LFOs or, you know, sample hold, you name it. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and it does actually provide feedback as well, so you can route feedback loops, but obviously you want to be careful doing that in regards to, you know, overloading the signal. So the mixers have the 4 inputs, and I'm just going to retune these oscillators just to give us a bit more definition between the 4 oscillators. So I'll take that. Okay, so you can see now we have the 4 oscillators coming in. Now, under these inputs, we have these 2 parameters for the vector module, vector X and Y for each mixer. And the vector actually works based on a XY axis on a plane, you know, like an XY plane. So the X would be a horizontal axis and the Y would be a vertical. And what it does is takes the 4 inputs and maps them to one of the corners or the quadrants of this XY plane. So the gist of this basically allows us to crossfade between these 4 inputs. So to do that, all it's it's just a simple matter of using these 2 controls to crossfade all of these 4 inputs. So clearly that's lots of fun when you start using modulation, and yeah, you get lots of interesting motion and movement. Now, on top of that, we have over here these external inputs. So you can actually route audio into Tranzistow. I'm not quite sure as far as the channels go for inputs 3 and 4, because if I have a extra channel here set up in Bitwig where I'm routing this audio track back into Tranzistow's external input here. So if I hit play inside of Bitwig, we're not hearing anything come out because it's routed into Tranzistow, and it's coming into this external input number 1. So with these external inputs, you can route the audio to the mixer or to the effects section straight up. So you're not actually going to hear any audio though until you have a gate with your MIDI, sort of a gate high with a MIDI note. So if we just turn these oscillators off for now. Actually, that's not very. The oscillator mutes actually don't affect the mixer inputs, which is interesting. But anyway, if we'll just drop these input levels down, and we can now hear that audio coming through into mixer 1. And I can play all keys across my keyboard, and we're just going to get the same audio. So by the sounds of that, you're going to get extra gain the more notes you hold. And it could be useful. I haven't really used this in any patches myself yet, but I guess it would be, pretty useful to have the effects. You can actually send that straight through to the effects section with the effects level here. You don't need to worry about using the MIDI gates to, activate the sound. So that's useful as if you want to use Tranzistow as an external processor for other audio. And it's well worth doing because the effects that Tranzistow has on board are, really, really good. Like, they're excellent. So if you want to use Tranzistow as an effects processor, it's well worth looking at. But that's, by and large, that is basically most of, I think, what we wanted to look at. So actually the amplifiers we'll just have a look at the amplifiers before I wrap this up. So you can see there's the first page under the filter amp tab shows us the inputs from each of the filters, A and B, and by default you'll find on amplifier 1 the signal coming through filter B is coming into amplifier 1. So we'll just turn those back up again. So now, yeah, we don't have the external input, which is good. And then we have the comb filter input. If you choose to use the comb filters, that has its own sort of input to the amplifier. We have the pan, so each amplifier can be panned left or right via, you know, across the stereo spread. But it's useful, I've found, for, you know, if you want to incorporate a lot of stereo into your patch, to engage amplifier 1 and 2 and hard pan them left and right. So for instance, like that. And then it can be nice to use a separate mix for each amplifier, for instance. You know, it's just fun to explore, you know, stereo in this sense. You can use lanes 1 and 2 and have different settings, you know, across the filters, the amp mixers, and whatever parameters, you know, you'd like to sort of differentiate between the two to create interesting stereo kinds of effects. So that's just a nice approach. Then if we look on the second tab, we have a pre-filter mix level, so we can run the audio that's coming through the filters into the amplifier and then blend a sort of dry signal or pre-filter signal into that as well, so you end up with a parallel kind of mix. And then we also have like a dedicated input to each amplifier, which you can again select from pretty much anywhere across the modules throughout Tranzistow. Anything that has an output you can use as an input here, more or less. And the level input mix is the basic kind of level of this input. And we have a DC filter as well for, you know, if you encounter any problematic kinds of DC voltage or, you know, offset. And then on the third hidden tab, we get access to a compressor. So each amplifier has its own onboard compressor, and you can use these different curves and waveforms to just control the behavior of the compressor. It's got typical kind of threshold and the amount and so on. So that's quite useful for taming, you know, a lot of wild dynamics and so on. Now, I think that basically covers most of the routing and signal flow kinds of you know, features. I guess I'll just mention before closing that all of the modules, besides the oscillators and the amplifiers and the mixer as well, all of the modules, they're all kind of not tied to the signal flow of the lanes, the 4 lanes. So any of the processing modules like the ring mod, the distortions like the overdrives, or the maybe perhaps I think the cone filter, the other filters are all pre-mixer, so they're sort of tied and sat in where they sit in the lanes of signal flow. But all the other processing modules, the sample and hold, the ring mod and so on, they're all kind of separate to the signal flow, so you can just engage these, and then if you want to tap their output, you can do so from, you know, various points, whether it's the mixers or the actual amplifier sort of input, which is here. So there's a kind of a bit of flexibility there. It's not actually tied to any point in the chain of the signal flow. So I think that about wraps it up. If you've got any comments or questions, if you feel I've overlooked something important, please drop us a line in the comments. I hope I've got this cross mix parameter. I really don't know exactly how that functions. I guess I'd like to know. So if anyone can shed some light there, that'd be fantastic. Otherwise, I'll wrap this up, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where I think we'll take a look at the filters and the filter sections. So I'll see you then.